Today's daf is daf Lamed Vav, and we'll begin with the Mishnah on the bottom of Lamed Hey Amid Beis. The Mishnah is going to present a machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Shchoto al menas laniach es domo, o a murav lemochar. Now, if the dam is left overnight, so we have a principle called Hadam Nifsal B'Shkias Hachama. With sunset of the day of the Hakrava, the dam becomes possible, and therefore the carbon is possible. And the same is true with regard to the Emurim. If the Emurim are left overnight, you cannot be makriv the Emurim. And now, he had a machshava at the time of the Shechita that he would leave the dam overnight or the Emurim overnight. In actuality, he didn't do so. He was zorek the dam during the course of the day, and he was mak to the emurim on the mizbech during the course of the day. So the only problem here is his machshava. Another case, ola hotzion lachutz. There's a psul of yotze if the dam leaves the azara. And again, we're talking about a case where the dam did not leave the azara. Everything was perfect, except for his machshava. And the Tanakama says that in this case, the carbon is kosher, but Rabbi Yehuda posel. It means that Rabbi Yehuda holds that your machshava, either in the case of the dam being left over, and we'll see the Gemara is going to call this hanocha. Hanocha meaning leave it over. He's leaving over the dam till tomorrow. He's leaving over the emurim till tomorrow. Or he has in mind to take the dam outside the azor. In all these cases, Rabbi Yehuda says that this is a machshava poseles. And the carbon is possible. We only had until now a psul machshava of one of three categories. We either had chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, which are what we call machshavas pigul, or we had shalol lishma in the cases of Pesach and Chatos. But other than that, machshava is not a posel. In the case of pigul, keep in mind, the machshavas pigul aposelis is because he had a machshava for a maisa of Zrika Sadam Chutzum Komo or Chutz Lizmano. Here, his machshava was Hanocha. Hanocha means the absence of a Maisa. He's going to leave the Dam where it is, the Emurim where it is, and that's called Machshavas Hanocha. According to the Chachamim, that's not a machshava posel, so the carbon still remains kosher. According to Rabbi Yehuda, a machshava for Hanocha is almost as if he did what he thought and intended to do. Now, the Gemara is going to claim that Rabbi Yehuda is based on Yalfusas, based on Psukim. In other words, in the Havamina of the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't know this bisvara. It's not a logical conclusion that he came to, because at the end of the day, the dam was nizrak kilchas. Everything was done perfectly. So how does Rabbi Yehuda derive the conclusion that even a machshava could passel the carbon? That's based on a limud, on a yalfusa pasuk. At the end of the sugya, we're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda is not based on a pasuk, but he's based on svara. Now the Mishnah talks about other cases where he had a wrong machshava, but the carbon is kosher even according to Rabbi Yehuda. For example, Almanas litnom al gabe hakevesh. So his machshava at the time of the shechita of the carbon was not for the zrika al gabe mizbeach, but the zrika al gabe hakevesh, which is called shalo b'mekomo, not in its proper place. or shalo keneged hayisod. That means that, as we mentioned many times, the Mizbeach was surrounded by a yisod, a base, on 3 out of 4 sides. One side, the southeastern side, was left open, and the zrika should not be done in that side. He had in mind an intention to do the zrika shalo keneged hayisod, or litena sanitonim lamala lamato, vesanitonim lamato lamala. Certain korbanos require zrika on the upper half of the mizbeach, above the chut hasikra, which separates the top from the bottom. Other korbanos have to be nizrak domam on lamata on the bottom, and he switched it around in his machshava. Again, all this is in his intention. Ve'es hanitonim, and here we turn to today's daf lamed vav, bifnim bachutz. Es hanitonim bachutz bifnim. So right, there are certain karbanos where the zrikas hadam is done bachutz on the mizbach hanachoshes. That's 99% of the karbanos, and then in a few cases the Torah requires that the zrika be inside the heichal on the mizbech hapnimi, and he had in mind to do it the other way around. Another case, sheochlu tmeim. He had in mind at the time of the shechita that the basar of the carbon should be eaten by tmeim. Now, a tummy is not allowed to eat the basar kodesh, as we discussed at great length yesterday. Or shiakrivu tmeim. Maybe the Kohen who's going to be makriv the carbon, because again, we're talking about Kohen number 1, who had in mind an intention at the time of the shechita that the zrikas hakarban would be done by a tameh, or she'achlu arelim, or the basar hakarban should be eaten by someone who is not circumcised, which is a violation of the iser of an orel to eat basar kodesh, or she'akrivu arelim, or a kohen who is an orel is possible to do that krov, and he had in mind time the shechita that the kohen orel will do the avoda. In the case of carbon pesach, l'shaber atzmos ha-pesach, the Torah says, the etzem lo tishbru bo, you're prohibited from breaking any bone of the lamb of the carbon pesach, and he had in mind at the time of the shechita of the pesach that they would break the bone of the lamb. Or lechol heimenu no, the Torah says al tochlu vimenu no mavushol, the carbon pesach could only be eaten tzli after it was roasted, and he had in mind that they would cook the basar pesach in a pot, and they would eat it cooked, which is a violation of Allah. But that was his intention. In all the above cases, there's one more case which is a little bit more complicated. Ula orev damo b'dam hapsulim. And what happens if there's a carbon that's possible, and the dam of that carbon is possible, and the shochet at the time that he did the shechita of the carbon, he had in mind that the zrika would be done with a combination, a mixture of 2 damim, of dam kosher with dam posel. In all these cases, kosher. And the word kosher here is written stam, which means it's not the shita of the chachamim in the Reisha, implying clearly that Rabbi Yehuda would concede in all the cases in the Sefer that the carbon is kosher. Now, why is the carbon kosher in the Sefer? The Mishnah explains, she'ein machshava poselas ela b'chutz zman u'chutz kol pesach l'chata shelo lishman, that we only recognize a machshava poseles in the cases of pigul, which is a machshava of chutz zmano or chutzum komo. Alternatively, in the case of shelo lishma, with regard to Pesach and Chatos. And what we're going to try to understand here, later on in the sugya, why Rabbi Yehuda concedes that in all the cases enumerated in the Sefer, the carbon is kosher. Why not say, the Gemara raises the question, that since he had a machshava for something that is totally unacceptable, and in fact, in the last case where the dam was mixed with dam pasul, for surely that is, you can't do the zrika in that case. The carbon is going to be pasul. So he had a machshava for a carbon pasul. Why shouldn't Rabbi Yehuda recognize that as a machshava poselis? The Gemara asks, my timer to Rabbi Yehuda. Meaning the premise of the Gemara's question is that there's no logical proof or scriptural proof to lead us to the conclusion that Rabbi Yehuda is correct, and that even a machshava of hanacha, to leave the dam over, leave the emurim over, even that would possibly korban. We don't have any reason to believe so. We know that the Torah apostles a korban in very few cases of machshava, whether it's shalol lishma and two korbanos, or whether it's a case of pigul, machshavas pigul chutzim kabel chutzim lizmano. Omer Rabbi Lazar trei kroi ksiva benosar. Nosar, of course, is the basar hakarban that was left beyond its time allotment. And the Torah repeats this prohibition twice. And the brisa of explaining Rabbi Yehuda, meaning the statement of Rabbi Loza, I should say, that is going to address the question, why did the Torah feel compelled? What to derive from the fact that the Torah repeated the same Isa twice? Echad Omer, in one pasuk it says, Lo sasiru mimenu ad boker. Rashi interprets that this pasuk appears in Parshas Bo, Shmos Perek Yud Beis, in the context of the Korban Pesach. Because of Echad Omer, we have another pasuk, Lo yaniach mimenu ad boker, and that appears in Vayikra Perek Zayin in the context of the Korban Toda. Im eino inyan lohaniach, tnehu leinyan machshavas hinuach. So now we apply a rule of droshos, which is called im eino inyan, and we try to figure out, why did the Torah repeat itself? It must be to include another case. And what is this case? This is the case of machshavas hinuach. Now keep in mind that according to Rashi, the first pasuk of Lo Sasiru Mimenu Boker is in the parsha of Pesach. The second is in the parsha of Toda. And the Gemara applies the rule of him eino inyan. Tosfos doesn't like this Rashi at all, because what do you mean him eino inyan? How would you derive conclusions from Pesach to Toda? Maybe in the case of Pesach, where the Torah is more machmir, the Torah requires that if you leave the Korban HaPesach overnight, it becomes nosar. But that would certainly not prove anything about a Korban Toda. You can't derive one from the other. And therefore, the Tosfos and many, many others reject Rashi, and they say that the first pasuk of Lo Sasiru Mimenu ad Boker is not in the parsha of Korban Pesach, but rather it's in the parsha of Toda. And in fact, if you look in the parsha of Toda, you will see that the Torah repeats twice. Once it says Lo Sasiru, and once it says Lo Yaniach. And now, the Gemara's im eino inyan makes a lot more sense, because why in the context of Toda did the Torah have to repeat itself? And here's where Rabbi Yehuda derives the conclusion im eino inyan. And the commentaries work over time to try to make sense out of Rashi here, but after all is said and done, it seems like the sheet of Tosfos is the correct sheet. So now the Gemara is going to analyze another statement of Rabbi Yehuda that's recorded in another brayso. So that seems to indicate that this pasuk is not being used to derive the machshava of hanocha, but for another reason. For Rabbi Yehuda, hai krola hachi yudiyasa, hai mi boilei chesanya. We need this pasuk for something entirely different. And Rabbi Yehuda himself is on record for deriving a different conclusion from this pasuk. Therefore, how do we use this pasuk to derive the conclusion of machshavas hanocha haposeles? And now we're going to take a look at a pasuk which is in Vayikra Vav, and it's a very long-winded pasuk. Rashi points out here that there are many extra words here in the pasuk. It says in the parsha of Korban Todah, Ubesar zevach todas shlomov biyom korbono ye'achel lo yanich v'mem ad boker. And now the Brisa is going to derive halachas from each one of these superfluous words. Ubesar zevach todas shlom. Lamanu letoda shenecheles liyom v'layla. The Torah says that the korban todah could be eaten until the next morning. So it means the korban was brought during the day, and you could eat the basar of the korban todah up until daybreak through the night, and then it becomes todah. However, chalipov uvlados tmuros minayin, there are three categories that we don't know exactly how much time is allotted by the Torah for achila. We don't know about chalipin. Chalipin would be a case where, let's say, he couldn't find the korban todah, so he substituted another korban, and then he found the original korban. What does he do with the korban that he designated as a substitute? And then you have a case of lados. Let's say the korban todah was pregnant and gave birth, or let's say the tmura, he did a tmura and he said areizu kazu. How do we know in all these cases that the same limitation applies, that you can only eat it yom v'layla, the day of the akrava and the night that follows it? Talmud lomar ubasa, right? So we're covering the second extra word in the pasuk, and then we go on and we say chatos v'yasham minon. Okay, that's as far as the korban todah with all its vlados and its chalipin and its tmura. But what about in the case of chatos or osham? How do we know that chatos or osham is eaten on that day and the night that follows up until daybreak? Talmud lomer zeva. That's the extra word zeva. U'minayin l'rabo shalmi nozir v'shalmi pesach. Okay, let's understand that shalmi nozir are the karbanos that the nazir brings at the termination of his nazirus. And when he brings these karbanos, amongst them are shalmi nazir, he then is allowed to drink wine, go into a beis hakvaros, he's allowed to cut his hair. And then we have something called shalmi pesach. Rashi identifies shalmi pesach as the korban chagiga of the night of the 14th of Nisan. And how do we know that the korban chagiga has to be eaten in the night and up until the following day? There's another korban chagiga, by the way, that's brought in the next day, but that could be eaten for 2 days. So we're talking about the korban chagiga of Yudalid, Rashi says. Tamaloma shlama, that's the extra word shlama. Lachmei toda v'chakos v'chalos urikikin shebenos u'minayin. Right, the korban toda was accompanied by lachmei toda, and they also have to be eaten. Some of them were eaten by the Kohanim, some by the Bailim. And we have chalos urikikish ben nazir, again part of the process of the nazir terminating his nazir. He brings rikikim, or certain kinds of wafers, and chalos and fully baked breads. How do we know that those have to be eaten in the same limitation, allowing it only day and night? Talmud lomar karbanos. Okay, fine. So where's the punchline of this price? So it's coming up now. Kulon koryani bahem lo yaniach. With regard to all of the above, the entire list that was enumerated here of extensions from Toda and onwards, they all come under the extra lav in the Torah, which is written in the Parsha of Toda, called Lo Yaniach. So B'mela, we need the Lo Yaniach to derive all these lavim that will tell you that the korban is possible and it cannot be eaten beyond its allotment. So now what the Gemara is going to try to do is the Gemara is trying to derive now two things from one pasuk. In Cain, the Gemara says if the Torah only wanted to incorporate extend all of those cases to the limitation of Yom and Laila, then lema kra lo sasiru. Why not just repeat the same words? The Torah always uses the term lo sasiru, but here, my lo yaniach. Why did the Torah change the language? And surprisingly, uses the language of lo yaniach. As therefore, that's why Rabbi Yehuda could derive another conclusion from the same pasuk. One conclusion he derives from the extra pasuk, but that alone does not satisfy the rational mind because it could have said lo sasiru again a second time, and then we would derive all these lavim and psulim from that pasuk. But now we have an additional derivation from the lo yaniach. Lo yaniach means machsheves hanoch. The Gemara is still not happy with it. The Gemara now is going to raise two problems. Problem number one, on the list of things that Rabbi Yehuda in the Reisha of Mishnah passes the korban is a machshava to take the dam or the emurim that have to be nektarim, and he wants to take them out of the Azara. Let's just go back for a minute to the Mishnah just to reiterate this. O lahotzion lachutz. Right, he has an intention to take the dam or the evarim p'darim haniktorim outside of the Azara. Now, that machshava, which Rabbi Yehuda says passes the korban because it's a machshava of hinuach, well, guess what? That can't be derived from this pasuk. This pasuk is referring to a korban toda and to all the dinim of a korban toda. And therefore, the Gemara asks v'od, time of Rabbi Yehuda svara, he decided, I'm going to prove to you from a brisa that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't derive it, as we saw in the first brisa, from a Yalfusa, but he derives it from Svara. By the way, I don't like the translation here. He translates Svara as logic. This is not human logic. You can't, you could study logic for the rest of your life in Princeton University, but this is not logic, but this is the way we derive halachas. And the Sanya, we learn in brisa, Omalahem, Rabbi Yehuda, Iatem Modim. Rabbi Yehuda is now debating with the Chachamim. Don't you admit if he would have left over the dam until the next day, or the emurim until the next day, or he takes the dam out of the azara, and therefore it's yotze, it's possible. So you agree it's possible, and therefore logically, why should the machshava be any different than the actualization of that machshava? And basically, Rabbi Yehuda introduces now a brand new svara, which is called machshava kemaisa, that the Torah sometimes considers that when you have a machshava, it's as if you implemented lamaisa that machshava. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says any maisa which would have passed the korban, if you have a machshava to do that maisa, that also passes the korban. El time of the Rabbi Yehuda svara. Fact Gemara, now we get back to the question that we asked at the beginning. Why is it that in the list in the Sefer, Rabbi Yehuda seems to admit that it's not possible, the korban is kosher? V'niflog nami Rabbi Yehuda v'kulu. So now the Gemara is going to go one by one, pick them off the list of the Sefer, and see if your question holds any water. Behind niflog, where do you want Rabbi Yehuda to disagree and say that the korban is possible? V'shover atzamos ha'pesach v'lechol menu. No, because he had a machshava that he's going to break the bones of the korban pesach. or he's going to eat it in a state of bishul and not sli. Zvicha gufa mi pasla. That can't pasel the carbon. A psul in the carbon has to be chal in the hakrava. The hakrava was perfect. And then he decides he's going to break a bone, so we'll break his bones, so to speak. I don't mean that literally, but we'll give malchus for breaking the bone of a carbon pesach or for eating the carbon. So that's all dinim in achila, in lavim, has nothing to do with the hakrava. The carbon is kosher. And if you're going to ask me, maybe Rabbi Yehuda should disagree in the case where he has an intention at the time of the shechita that the basa, the carbon, should be eaten by tmeim, or that a tamei should do the akrava. Zivcha gufe mi mifsal. Would this invalidate the carbon and make it into a carbon puzzle? If someone actually committed these acts, it wouldn't puzzle the carbon, because we discussed in the past that if a tamei eats the basar, he's chayav kares, because the tamei is enjoined from eating kachim, but it doesn't mean that the carbon becomes puzzle. And even if a tamei would actually do it, then we said that we can still rectify it. So therefore, according to what we're saying now, Rabbi Yehuda would not passel the carbon because of a person who had an intention, a machshava, that either a tamei should eat the basar, or that a tamei should burn the basar on the mizbeach. All that would not passel the carbon. So how can the machshava passel the carbon? Let's go on. She'achlu arelim she'ikruv arelim is zivcha gufe mi mifsal. If the basar, the carbon, was eaten by an arel, or if an arel would perform these avodos, let's say he would burn the avarim on the haktorah would be done by an arel, it would not passel the carbon. I mean, once the zrika was done, the zrika clinches the kapara, and whatever happens later it would not passel the carbon l'mafreya. Lishnachrina. Kol kamine, right? Does the shochet have any power to make a tamei person or an orel do the avoda? I mean, he doesn't have the power through his intention of machshava to make that happen. Okay, but now we get to the last case in the Mishnah, and that's a little bit more complicated. Li arev dama b'dam psulim. What's going on over here? If there's a mixture of dam posel with dam kosher, then the zrika would certainly be posel. And therefore, if he has an intention, and Rabbi Yehuda's sheet is predicated on the svara of the rule of machshava kemaisa, this certainly should be a carbon posel. And Gemara answers, Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei v'yomer ein dam mevatel dam. This goes back to the Rabbi Yehuda that we discussed yesterday and the day before yesterday about min b'mino eino batel, which means that even though he has a mixture of dam posel, that doesn't undo and disqualify the dam that's kosher. And therefore, when he zorek this mixture, the dam kosher reaches the mizbeach and the carbon is kosher. Let's go on. Litenes aniton l'mal l'mata l'mal l'mata. Oh, Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei di Omar shalol b'mkomo nami kimkomo karinale. Rabbi Yehuda happens to be of the opinion, and this we studied earlier in the Masechta, that shalol b'mkomo kimkomo dami, that even if he puts the dam in the wrong place, nevertheless it's considered as if he put it in the right place. So even though it should have been on the upper half of the mizbeach, and instead he put it on the lower half, or vice versa, the carbon is kosher. The Gemara asks, "V'liflog b'nitanim b'fnim shenesanam b'chutz." Right, we have those karbanos that have to be brought into the hechel. The dam needs to have zrika on the mizbeach hapnimi, on the mizbeach hazav, and instead he did the zrika on the mizbeach hachitzoni. Is that should certainly be possible. And hanitana b'chutz shenisana b'fnim, or vice versa. And the Gemara says, "K'sav Rabbi Yehuda be'inin makom she'em meshulash b'dam b'basar u'be'murim." So the word meshulash as we'll soon see, Rabbi Yehuda is going to derive it from a pasuk, means that the intention has to be to apply the dam in a place where it would passel, number one, the basar, number two, the emurim, and number three, the dam. And that could be only outside the azar. But here, he's having machshavos inside the azara, whether it be above, below, whether it be inside the heichal, outside the heichal, but it's all in the azara. Now, I think here he quotes the pasuk. Let's just see. Yeah. So if he has a machshava that the basar niktar, which I call a varim updorim, should be consumed by the mizbeach, should be consumed outside of the azara. That passes the carbon. So now he introduces heter bamos. Let's just see. Let's try and see if there's an easier way, a shortcut here. Right. So again, the bottom line is here that outside the azara, that's a machshava posels, but not inside the azara. And why is outside the azara a machshava poseles? Because there are situations in which the dam could be, how should I say, could be thrown. I don't like that word, but could be nizrak outside the azara, and that's during the period of heter bamos. So therefore, if he had in mind that kodshe kodshim should be eaten outside the azara, or in the case of kodshim kalim outside Yerushalayim, that passes the carbon. And if he had intention to be zorik the dam or to burn the emurim outside the azara, that would invalidate the carbon, but not within the azara itself. Fracting Gemara, me isle Rabbi Yehuda Isfar. I'm going to bring you a contradictory brisa. The Rabbi Yehuda never accepted this meshulash. Desanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer Dover Ra. Okay, let's read the whole pasuk here in Dvarim. Perak Yud Zayin. It says, "Lo sizbach Lashem Elokecha shor vaseh asher bo mum kol Dover Ra ki tovas Hashem Elokecha hu." So Rabbi Yehuda, in this brisa that we're learning now, wants to know, why did the Torah add the word davar ra? That phrase davar ra is totally superfluous. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda derives a ribui, riba kan chata sheshchata badarom, v'chata shenichnas dama lifnim psula. Right, a chatas has to be shechted in the tzafon. He went ahead and he shechted the chatas in the darom, or alternatively, he shechted the chatas with a machshava that the dam should be brought. I think we're talking about a chatas achitzona within the sanctuary, and that's going to passel the carbon. And that's against Meshulash, because now it's within the Azara. So now the Gemara says, okay, you've proven to me that Rabbi Yehuda rejects the requirement of Meshulash, and you could have a Machshava Posels even within the Azara, but Leslie Rabbi Yehuda Shlishi v'asanya Omar Rabbi Yehuda hichnis b'shogeg kosher, that if someone took one of the chatos hachitzonios and he inadvertently brought it into the heichal and did the zricha inside the heichal, the carbon is kosher, and we could be medayik from that. Hope it mazid pasul. If it was mazid, then it would be pasul. Kaimalon b'shakiper. Now, again, in a case where he intentionally took the chatos inside, meaning inside the heichal, it's still within the azara, and yet Rabbi Yehuda holds that if it was b'shogeg, the carbon is kosher. So it must be that he holds from this requirement of mishulash, and therefore any machshava of chutz la'azara that could passel the carbon. I'm sorry, any machshava within the azara could passel the carbon, but not outside the azara. Hashdu ma hosam aili keeper in keeper lo hocha de choshiv chashuve lo kolshkein. And the Gemara answers Trei Tanoia Libed Rabbi Yehuda. So this approach of the Gemara that if you have a stira of two different versions or transmissions of what Rabbi Yehuda held, you're going to always say that it's a machlokas Tanoim about what Rabbi Yehuda's sheet is. This is going to repeat itself again and again. For example, the Gemara says, "V'sov Rabbi Yehuda chata sheshchata b'dorom." If he went ahead and he shechted a korban chatos in the dorm instead of the tzofan, he's going to be chayav. He gets malchus for that. And now we're on Daf Lamed Vav and Beis, Yeh chayav. So now we have Rabbi Yehuda going on record as saying that if he shechts the korban chatos in the dorum, he gets malchus. But we have a contradictory brisa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Yochel, I might think chatos sheshchata b'dorum Yeh chayav. Talmud Lomer lo tizbach l'Shem Elokecha shor v'aseh kol dovara al dovara, which dovara means a balmum, al dovara tomachayvo, if he shechs a korban that is a balas mum, then he's chayav, he gets malchus, v'yatomachayvo al chatos sheshchata b'dorom. But this pasuk of dovara is coming as an exclusion to teach me that if he shechs the korban chatos in the dorom, he's not chayav malchus. And once again, Trei Tanoia Libed Rabbi Yehuda, we have two different versions of what Rabbi Yehuda held. Now, in our Mishnah, as we go on in the Gemara, if a carbon was shechted with a machshava, an intention to hanocha, meaning to leave its dam till tomorrow, or to leave the Evarim Haniktorim till tomorrow, then Rabbi Yehuda holds the carbon is possible. However, now the Gemara wants to analyze, all right, he had that machshava at the time of the shechita, and Rabbi Yehuda's svara is that machshava kemaisa, and therefore machshavas hinuach passes the carbon. But what about the subsequent avodos after shechita? If he has a machshava of chutz l'zman or chutz l'mkomo, would there be would the pigul be generated? Would there be a chalushem pigul generated? Omar Rabbi, I know it says in my Gemara Rabbi Abba, but here in the Sosach it says Rava. Umoder Rabbi Yehuda shechozer v'koval a pigul. That if in the subsequent avodos he has in mind chutz zman or chutz m'komo, then it generates a shem pigul with an isakaris in the case of shalo chutz zman. And Rava now is going to support this svara. Teda. I'm going to prove this to you. The pigul lifnei zrika lav klumhu. Right, a machshavas pigul only passes the carbon when he goes ahead and he does the zrika. And we've discussed this in the past, that pigul is chal when everything else was done properly. So therefore, pigul lifnei zrika lo klumu. The Asya Zrika v'Kovale Pigul, and nevertheless, when he goes through with the Zrika, at that point, his Machsheves Pigul kicks in and generates the Shem Pigul. So therefore, we go back to the original statement of Rava or Rabbi Abba, the way we have it, that if the Shochet shechted the karba with the Machshava to leave Machsheves Hanocha, Hinuach, to leave the dam until tomorrow, he can still generate Pigul in the subsequent avodos. And why is that so? Because we see that even though the Machshavas Pigul took place before the Zrika, later on when he does the Zrika, that original Machshava will generate Pigul. Velohi, the Gemara rejects it. There's no analogy here. Hasam hu chada Machshava. Chada Machshavi. Hacha trei Machshavos. In the case of Rava, okay, he had a Machshavas Pigul in a subsequent avoda, and the original machshava was also machshavas pigul. So these two will integrate to form one machshavas pigul and generate pigul. But hacha, in this case, that Rabbi Abba is talking about, there were two different machshavos. And the original machshava was hinuach, meaning to leave it over until tomorrow. And then he had a subsequent machshava, which is during the avoda, he had a chutz zman and chutz koma. That's already a whole different machshava. And the two different machshavas can't integrate into one whole, and therefore the machshavas pigul that came subsequent would not generate pigul. Esvi Rav Huna Rabbi Abba. Now that you've already put Rabbi Abba down sort of in his place, now we're going to really smash him from a brisa. Litain esaniton lamala mata lamata lamala li alter kosher. Right, let's say he had a machshava that instead, at the shchita, that instead of doing the zrika above the line, the sikra, or he will do it below the line, or vice versa. Li alter kosher. If his intention was to do the zrika sadam on that day, on that same day, then the korban is kosher, which means that since he intends for the Zrika Saddam to be today, in its time, it's kosher. And this seems to reflect the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, because the implication would be that if he had a Machshavas Hinuach for tomorrow, then the korban would be possible. Now, after he had this Machshava of Lamala Lamata Lamata Lamala, even though, again, that machshava per se would not passel the korban, unless he had a machshava to leave it over till tomorrow. And here he had a machshava to do the zrika today, so that Rabbi Yehuda would agree that the korban should be kosher. But chazar v'chishav chutzum komo passel v'yein kares. Right, because we always said that chutzum komo generates pigul but no kares. Chutzum mano generates a full-fledged pigul and chayovin alech kares. Oh, but now we get to our case. Lemachar, the Kohen had in mind the machshavas hinuach to leave the dam until tomorrow. So again, he has two machshavos here. One machshava is lamal lamata, meaning it should be a zrika in the wrong place, shalom koman, and on top of it, he has a machshava that the dam should be applied tomorrow. We're going to leave the dam overnight. And in such a case, the korban is possible. And chazav v'chishev bein chutz zman bein chutzim kol possible in both kares. Okay, you have to understand why there's no kares, but let's take, for example, the case of chutzim komo, which never generates kares. And here we have to connect this Gemara to a Gemara that we learned back on Chav Zayin, that the Gemara said that his original machshava would passel the korban, because we're going like Rabbi Yehuda, that a machshavas hinuach passels the korban, and he had in mind to leave the dam until tomorrow. And yet the Brisa says that there would be pigul. Again, there's no kares, but there is pigul. is Tiyufta the Rabbi Abba, Tiyufta after Rabbi Abba said that even though he had a machshava originally poselis, according to Rabbi Yehuda in machshava sinuach, nevertheless a subsequent machshava could make it into pigul. And here we're saying that what? That if he had a machshavas pigul after, just 1 second. Now, just 1 second. Let me just get the cheshbon. Just 1 second. I'm sorry. The raya of the Gemara against Rabbi Abba is from machshavas chutz l'zmano, because it says machshavas chutz l'zmano is possible the aimbo karis, meaning it's not pigul. So it's only possible because his original machshava, according to Rabbi Yehuda, passes it because he had a machshava of hanocha, of hinuach shalo, like lamacha, for tomorrow. The dam will be nizak tomorrow. So now, according to Rabbi Abba, why shouldn't his machshava of chutz zmano generate pigul? And the Gemara says tiyufta. We don't have an answer. Omer al chiz omer avina bar sila. Chishev sheyochluhu tmeim lemachar. Now he has a double machshava. Number one, he has in mind that the tamei should eat the basar. Number two, he has in mind that he'll eat the basar tomorrow. Now, if he has in mind that the basar will be eaten tomorrow, that's a machshavas pigul of chutz l'zmano and should generate a chiyuv kares. Comes along Rav Chizda and he says, Eino chinami. Chayav. Now, this is a big chiddush here, Rav Chizda, because he already had a machshava of she'achlu tmeim l'machar. And once he has a machshava l'machar, and once he has a machshava she'achlu tmeim, then the chutz l'zmano here is on the yachila of a tameh. The yachila of a tameh doesn't register because there's no possibility of a tameh eating it. So why would that machshava kick in? But the answer is he also has a machshava of lemachar. And lemachar is a machshavas chutz zmano, and that's enough to generate pigul, despite the fact that he has an additional machshava she'ochlenu tmein. Well, my Rava Teda. Rava tries to substantiate Rav Chizda, but the Gemara is not going to accept it. The basar lifnei zrika lo chazi. Okay, we spoke about this in the past. That the matir of achilas basar, whether it's shlomim for Kol Yisrael, whether it's chatos for zechekuna, is the zrika. V'chima chashiv bei mifsal. Right, so if the Kohen has a machshavas pigul on the basar of chutz zmano, then it becomes pigul. Now, originally, we're talking about basar before zrika, and basar before zrika is prohibited, right? It didn't have the matir of zrika. And now later on, he has a machshavas pigul, and it generates pigul. So Rava says that would support Rav Chizda. Why? Because you see that a machshavas pigul can generate pigul, even the fact that the Kohen had in mind that it should be eaten by a tamei lemachar, but it doesn't matter, right? Just like before zrika, you're not allowed to eat the basar. So to a tamei is not allowed to eat the basar. So those two equal each other out, and yet there's machshavas pigul. The Gemara says, "Velohi, what kind of comparison is that? Hasam zarik umichse, hacha lo michse klal." Right, in the case where the dam will eventually get a zrika, and the meat therefore will be subject to a heter, So if not for the fact that he had a machshavas pigul, the basar would be mutter, ba'achila. You could consume it legitimately because there was a zrika. That's one thing. And therefore, I can understand that pigul, with a machshavas pigul, you generate pigul. Because the zrika will be matir the basar. But in the case of a tameh, there's no possibility of being matir the basar. Hachalo michse klal. In Rav Chisda's case, in the case of a tameh eating kodesh, it will never become mutter. There's no matir for a tameh. Again, he could be matar himself, but calls mani's tameh, there's no matir. So therefore, how do you know that a machshavas pigul will generate pigul? Rav Chisda says margola. Now, when I was a child, they taught me that margola means a pearl in his mouth, a pearl of wisdom, as we say. Befume, he has a different interpretation, whatever. Anyway, befume Rav Dimi bar Chinina. And what was the statement of Rav Dimi bar Chinina that's being praised over here is Besar Pesach Shelo Hutzla. If instead of doing a tzli on the Besar Pesach, they did something else, they cooked it, or lachme toda shelo hurmu, right? Now, lachme toda, you have to do a hafrasha before you can eat the lachme toda. And in fact, the hafrasha is a little bit complicated. There are 40 breads, 10 of them in each species. There are 4 different species, varieties. And then 1 loaf from each of these 10, meaning 1 loaf times 4, is given to the Kohen. But only after you mafresh it for the Kohen, then the Bailam are allowed to eat the other 9 of each of the 4 categories. Is chayov and oleh mishum tuma. Now, a tameh is enjoined from eating kodesh with a chiyuv kares. So why is he chayiv kares here? Chayav and oleh mishum tuma. Right. I forgot. Yeah, Rav Chisda has a principle here that you don't need an actual heter achila in order to generate the isur of a tameh eating kodesh, even if there's no heter. But theoretically, there could be a heter if he had broiled the meat, or if he had been mafresh the 1 lechem of the 10 for the Kohen. So that theoretical possibility that it lends itself in the abstract conceptual world to a heter, that's enough to fulfill this condition of nitar l'tahorim, that it could be mutter for a tahor. And if it's nitar l'tahorim, then the tameh is chayav kares. Amarava teda. And Rav again is going to substantiate the logic of Rav Chisda. Desanya, we learned in the Brisa, Asher Lashem. Okay, let's read the pasuk. Here in Vayikra Zayin, it says, "Vanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlomim asher lashem v'tumasa olav v'nichrasa." So what does that mean? Asher lashem. I guess it's an extra 2 words in the pasuk. L'rabos imurei kodshim kalam l'tumah. Right, that a tameh is not allowed to eat that which is niktar al gabi mizbeach. Now, if it's niktar al gabi mizbeach, which is called a murim, then it can never be eaten by Adam. So why is the tameh chayav kares for eating that which is niktar, the murim al gabi mizbeach? We said it has to be something that is nitar litahorim. It's not nitar litahorim if it's designated for the mizbeach. Alma, what do we see? This is all Rava discussing. Afal gav de lav b'nei achila ninhu. Right? There's no way that under the sun that you're allowed to eat it because it's it's a case of a murim. And nevertheless, chayoven aleya mishum tuma. If a tummy eats them, then he's chayav. It's hochanami. Here too, afal gav de lav b'nei achila ninhu. Right? There was no heter because they didn't roast the Korban Pesach, and they weren't mafresh that one loaf from the 10 for the Kohen. It's chayav and alev mishum tuma and velohi. The Gemara rejects. Hasam, there in the case of a murim is kodshim kalam chazul gavoah. There is an achila. It's so strange to me that sometimes in kodshim the Gemara equates achilas mizbeach with achilas adam. Sometimes the Gemara differentiates, like in machshavas and so forth. But here the Gemara is going to equate achilas mizbeach. So, for example, the emurim are subject to achilas mizbeach. La'afuke b'sar pesach shel hutza v'lach mitol shel hurmo d'lo chazu lo l'gvav v'lo le'ejo. Right? If the basar pesach was not broiled, it was cooked, or there was no separation of that loaf of the 10 for the Kohen, then you can't be makter it on the Mizbeach, and no person can eat it. So in that case, it's very conceivable that there would be no chakares if a tummy ate it, because again, it's not mutarim b'tahorim. Lishnachrina ha emurim lo chazu. That Rava's point was that again the emurim are not roy lachila velohi, and why did they reject it? Meaning, there's no proof that a tamei should be chayv kares. Hana chazu l'mil sayu v'hani lo chazu klal. It's very similar to the first lishna. I don't know exactly how it's different, but he's saying that in the case of a murim, it's roy le haktara gabi mizbeah. But here, in the case of a korban pesach that was cooked and not broiled, or if you have these loaves that are untied, is lo chazu klal. Hadran alecha kol apsulim, and b'li neder, tomorrow we'll pick it up in the 4th perek, which is called Beit Shammai. Okay then? So have a great day. Thank you so much.